Background. We got married when we were both just 20. About a year into our marriage, I decided to return to school part-time to finish my degree. Soon after, we had a child, and the pressure to complete my degree intensified. My son was just turning 2 when I began my final year of college. I only had 2 semesters left to go. By September 1993, my schedule was packed. I worked a part-time job as a store stocker from 3 a.m. to 7 a.m., followed by a full-time administrative job at the police department from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. I attended classes on Tuesday nights from 5:30 p.m. to 10 p.m. and on Saturdays from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. My wife worked as a nurse's aide at a local hospital from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. Thankfully, my mother helped take care of our son. Everything we needed was conveniently close, with no location more than a 10-minute drive away. We had set up as well as we could under the circumstances. D-Day. The weekend before D-Day was a mess. It was spring 1994 and finals week for me. If I could finish my papers and pass my finals by Sunday, we'd be celebrating me completing my bachelor's in science and finally wrapping up this grueling 8-month schedule. But my wife was furious that I wouldn't take a break from studying to take her and our son somewhere. She had been complaining about my work and school for a while, and it had gotten so bad that we'd stopped having sex 2 months ago. On that particular Monday evening, while I was fact-checking a research paper due the next evening, she kept starting fights. I finally snapped and told her to shut up and stop acting like a child. She looked at me with a steely gaze and said, "I hate you and I'm in love with someone else." Just like that. I was completely blindsided. We argued for about an hour until she confessed to what had happened earlier that day at work. It turned out that for the past 2 months, she had been having an emotional affair with a janitor at the hospital. It all began with him giving her compliments and constantly showing up whenever she was around. Their interactions escalated from cafeteria lunches to regular complaints about me. About 2 weeks before, they'd moved their complaints to the car. She admitted to kissing him twice during that period, but today, things had gone further. There had been a full-blown makeout session, with her giving him a handjob while he fingered her, and they ended up professing their love for each other. When I heard this, I felt like I was floating outside of reality. I was numb and detached, and I'll dive deeper into my mental state from that night later. For now, here's what my wife wrote about that moment. It was strange. When I told him what we had done, I was ready for some kind of outburst. He just stared at me with the most excruciating pain you can imagine. Then his expression went blank. He turned around, walked to the bedroom, and quietly closed the door. I remember feeling angry then. The jerk wouldn't even fight for me? At that moment, I knew I had made the right choice, and everything was going to work out. I did it. I was finally breaking free from the man who had been ignoring me for months. I came back to the living room with a suitcase and walked right past her out the front door. She kept asking where I thought I was going, with "running home to mommy" being one of the things she said. I set the suitcase down in the driveway, went back inside, grabbed her purse, and told her to leave. She was stunned and refused. I gently threw her over my shoulder, carried her outside, and set her down on the car's hood. Her shock gave me just enough time to get back inside and lock the door. She tried to get in, but I held the deadbolt. Eventually, she left to stay with her parents. She told them we were separating but didn't mention the details. That night was incredibly long. I called both of my jobs to explain that I had a family emergency and wouldn't be coming in the next day. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I fell asleep. Tuesday D-Day +1, I woke up at 7, immediately setting to work on how to minimize contact with my soon-to-be ex. My first call was to my mother, asking her to keep my son for the day. She was concerned, since he was usually there by then. After that, I made a list of tasks I needed to tackle and got to work on it right away. First, I dropped my son off and told my mother that I would need to sit down with her later that day to discuss things in detail. Next, I headed over to a lawyer friend of the family's office. He'd known me since I was a kid, having gone to school with my dad. I told him I wanted to file for divorce as quickly as possible. He listened to my story and suggested I take some time to think it over, but I was firm in my decision. He said he could have the divorce papers ready by the end of the day. I agreed to pick them up and file them myself at the clerk's office, as I was familiar with that process from my job at the police department. Then, I went out to get new locks for the house, and stopped by the bank to close both our savings and checking accounts. I withdrew half of the money, put it in an envelope, and took it to my sister-in-law's workplace, handing it over as my wife's share. I instructed her to let my wife know that she should not contact me, and that this was her half of the money. I also informed her that I had canceled our only credit card. Returning to my mom's place, I filled her in on everything. She and my little sister quickly devised a plan for my sister-in-law to stay at my house and look after my son while I went to work and school for the rest of the week. I went back home, changed the locks, and spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning and playing with my son before heading to school. Meanwhile, my wife chose not to go to work that day. She reached out to the janitor and told him what had happened. He offered her a place to stay to escape the stress, which she accepted. More on this place later. To keep it short, she went over there and slept with him. Here's what she wrote about that night. He fell asleep afterward. I was so excited at the start, but during and after it felt wrong. With him asleep, my mind started wandering. I thought about G____ me and how he had driven me to find someone else. I drove home, remembering the first time G and I had sex. We were each other's first. I broke down, feeling disgusted with myself, and then got angry with G again. It was a twisted cycle. I couldn't face the reality of how awful my actions were and convinced myself it was all his fault. Wednesday, D-Day +2. The day started off like any other. I went to work, came home, showered, and had breakfast with my son and sister. My wife called, wanting to arrange a visit with our son. Her tone was arrogant and bitter. I told her she could see him on Sunday at 1 p.m. at a local park. That wasn't good enough for her. She wanted him for the whole weekend. I refused. She knew that having him stay at the house helped with babysitting since both her parents worked, so she dropped the issue. She hung up angrily. I went to my shift at the police department, and as soon as I could, I went to the clerk's office to file for divorce. Later, a girl I knew from the office informed me that they were ready to be served at the sheriff's office. I called a deputy I knew, explained the situation, and asked if he could serve the papers at her workplace. He agreed to do it the next day. Meanwhile, my wife went back to work. Her janitor came by her station and chatted her up throughout the day. They didn't manage to have lunch together or meet that evening. He said he had to attend something with his kids. He had previously told her he was divorced and had 3 children. After work, she went to her parents' place. That night, she called me 3 times, but I hung up each time after realizing it was her calling. Caller ID was not common in my area at that time. Thursday, D-Day +3. After another restless night of grief, I started my day just like the previous one. I went to work, and once I got to my second job, the deputy who was going to serve the divorce papers called. He said he'd arrive around noon, which worked for me since her lunch hour was from 11 a.m. to noon. I sat at my desk, trying to focus on work, but I was so anxious that I went to the restroom at least 3 times and ended up throwing up. I tried to calm myself and kept reminding myself that this was the right thing to do. Fortunately, I hadn't heard from my wife yet. At 11 a.m., my wife met the janitor for lunch. They retreated to his car in the parking lot and had sex. Afterward, they cleaned up and went back inside to grab something from the cafeteria. At noon, my wife returned to the nurse's station on her hall with the janitor and started talking to the RN in charge. Just then, the deputy walked in. He asked the RN where he could find my wife. When she identified herself, the deputy turned to her and in a loud voice announced, "Mrs. K, you are being sued for divorce due to infidelity." My wife collapsed on the floor. Here's how she described the moment. Hearing that, I felt a massive wave of shame and guilt. It hit me that I had destroyed my marriage and that G was really going to divorce me. Some part of me was still convinced he wouldn't actually do it. I thought this was just another argument I was trying to win. It was a sick delusion. I remember the deputy physically lifting me into a chair. There was screaming. It was me. The RNA was trying to calm me down, and T, the janitor, tried to hold my hand, but I punched him. He turned his head so the punch hit his neck. I scratched him as he pulled away. A said I was yelling at him, accusing him of ruining my life. They managed to calm me down eventually. The deputy said the janitor left immediately. I was able to return to my shift, but A covered for me a lot. 2:45 p.m. As my wife was nearing the end of her shift, She was summoned to the hospital administrator's office. She was anxious, fearing someone had reported her outburst. When she arrived, the administrator shut the door and immediately informed her that she was fired. She was told not to return to the property and that her final paycheck would be sent by mail. It turned out that someone had witnessed the incident in the parking lot and reported it. A had been called in and recounted the story about the divorce papers. The janitor had been questioned, fired, and escorted off the premises just an hour before my wife was let go. News of the scandal had spread throughout the hospital. My wife went straight to her parents' house, where they still didn't know the full details, only that we were separating, and it seemed serious. 5:30 p.m. I was having dinner with my son at home. My sister was out with friends, so it was just the two of us. The deputy had updated me on the earlier events, and I felt a grim satisfaction knowing the impact. It was just dumb luck that the janitor was there at the right time. I was surprised my wife hadn't been arrested for assaulting him, but then again, you can't get everything. Suddenly there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find a short, heavily pregnant woman standing there, barely able to stand upright. She asked for Kay. I told her that Kay no longer lived here and wouldn't be returning. When she asked if I was her husband, I replied that I was her soon-to-be ex-husband, having served the papers earlier that day. She introduced herself as Dee, the janitor's wife, and said she was pregnant with their fourth child. I invited her in to sit down. She explained what had happened, about her husband and my wife being fired and the circumstances leading up to it. I felt nauseated. Who was this crazy woman I had married? She also revealed details about the house where my wife had met the janitor. At that moment, I felt like I could have killed the janitor on the spot, not just for my wife, but for humanity. This guy was a real piece of work. More on the house later. Dee asked where my wife was, and I told her she was at her parents' place. After she assured me she only wanted to talk to her and tell her the truth, I gave her directions. My son was still in his chair at the table, visible from where we sat in the living room. Dee commented on how wonderful I was for taking care of my son alone, then got up and left. 6:30 p.m. Dee arrived at my in-laws' house and asked to speak to my wife. Assuming she was a friend of Kay's, my father-in-law went to fetch her. Kay came out on the porch to talk to Dee, who identified herself and said she wanted to explain the truth about what had happened with the janitor. Dee and the janitor were still married and living together, and she was 8 months pregnant with their fourth child. Kay was already upset and crying, apologizing repeatedly, but things took a turn for the worse. It turned out that the janitor, along with another hospital employee and a friend, were involved in a game to see how many married women they could sleep with in 90 days. My wife was the janitor's third. The janitor had also slept with a fourth woman the night he'd claimed to be busy with his kids. Dee mentioned that this woman was married for 25 years and that she would be informing her husband next. The house was a place they rented to bring the women. Dee had found out about all this 2 hours after the janitor was fired. He came home high and crying, confessed everything, and attempted to reconcile. Dee left with the kids and told my wife she was leaving him. She then slapped my wife hard across the face and called her a stupid cow. Kay was shocked. Dee told her she should be ashamed of ruining her family and that she had seen a loving man feeding his son all alone because his wife was a selfish, worthless whore. My wife lost control, crying uncontrollably, and Dee walked away, got in her car, and left. My in-laws checked on her after hearing the car drive off. She was essentially catatonic. They got her inside and were discussing taking her to the emergency room when she began rambling incoherently. My father-in-law thought she might be on some kind of drug. She spoke about how terrible she felt and how she had to make things right. Eventually, they calmed her down and got the full story. My father-in-law was deeply hurt. He was and is a good man, and he said he could see the shame and disappointment on his face. My mother-in-law, as usual, blamed me. I'm not particularly fond of her. Immediate aftermath. The next day, my father-in-law called me, and for the first time, I could hear the tremble in his voice. He apologized and told me that Kay had been holed up in her room all day and night. I updated him about the meeting Kay was supposed to have with me on Sunday at 1 p.m. at the park. He acknowledged this and hung up. I worked Friday and attended school on Saturday. By the end of the day, I found out I had passed my courses and would be receiving my degree. It was a bittersweet moment, but I had achieved my goal. My parents threw a celebration that night. with extended family coming over for a cookout. I'm grateful for my family. They didn't bring up Kay at all. The following day, Kay didn't show up for our scheduled meeting. I saw it as a blessing in disguise, something I could potentially use in a custody hearing if necessary. At 3:30 p.m., her father called again. He said Kay was still not responding coherently and was wandering around in her bathrobe, clutching a notebook she wouldn't let go of. She hadn't bathed in days and was eating very little. He was worried, exhausted, and afraid she might hurt herself. He asked me to come see her. I declined. I felt nothing for her. I told him to get her professional help and that I'd let her see our son once she got herself together. After the turmoil I'd been through, I was determined never to care about her again. I didn't hear from her or her family for the next 2 weeks. Reconciliation. 2 weeks after my last conversation with my father-in-law, a lot had shifted in my life. I had quit my part-time job to focus on finding a new full-time position and was now actively pursuing job opportunities. My plans for the future included eventually getting my MBA, but I wanted to stabilize my new job first. Meanwhile, my son was increasingly asking about his mother, which was heart-wrenching and difficult to navigate. I had to balance my own pain and the need to shield him from the complexities of the situation. The longer Kay stayed out of touch, the more it seemed to benefit my chances in any potential custody dispute. One day while I was working at the PD, Kay called and requested to set up a time to see our son. I was initially cautious and asked if she had managed to pull herself together sufficiently not to scare him. Kay assured me she had. I agreed to meet her at the park on Saturday at 9 a.m., on the condition that she bring her father with her. I didn't want to meet her alone, and I asked my mother to accompany me for support. When I saw Kay at the park, it became clear that I had made the right decision to restrict her contact with our son to just a few hours at a time. She was visibly struggling. She had lost a significant amount of weight, was not wearing makeup, and had a distinct lack of the usual feminine fragrances I had associated with her. Her appearance was a stark contrast to the woman I had known. I later found out that her mother had bathed and dressed her, which painted a vivid picture of just how much she was struggling. Our meetings at the park continued for a few weeks, initially limited to 2 hours, and I eventually extended them to 4 hours and included Sundays. Kay appeared to improve with each visit, but I remained cautious. I was concerned about her mental stability and refused to allow overnight stays or unsupervised time with our son. This cautious approach seemed necessary for both his well-being and her recovery. Despite my reservations, my mother-in-law became increasingly frustrated with the restricted visitations and hired an attorney to pursue full custody of our son. This was a significant blow, as I had already expressed my willingness to work up to a 50-50 custody arrangement. Her mother's aggressive stance undermined the potential for a more amicable arrangement and escalated the situation. In response, I requested full custody, citing mental instability as the primary reason. I needed an outlet for my anger, and this legal battle became the focus of that frustration. On the day of the custody hearing, my lawyer informed me that Kay's attorney wanted to speak with me privately. Although I was reluctant, I agreed, provided it took place in the hallway outside the courtroom, where both attorneys could see us, but not hear our conversation. Kay started with small talk, asking about our son and my school. I shared that I had passed my courses and was graduating soon. When she asked if she could attend the graduation, I declined, stating that it was meant for family and friends, and she was neither. Her reaction was one of pain, which I intended to convey to her. I wanted her to fully grasp the consequences of her actions and their impact on our relationship. Kay then took the stand. She listened to my testimony and heard how I had been taking care of our son throughout the separation. She realized she needed to make things right. Kay requested to speak directly to the judge despite her lawyer's advice. She apologized to both our parents and admitted that she knew I hated her more than anyone else. She took full responsibility for the breakdown of our marriage and expressed a desire to salvage whatever she could of our past. She offered to withdraw her custody claim and agreed to any custody arrangement I deemed fit. After consulting with my attorney, we offered a plan of supervised 1-hour visits for 6 weeks, followed by every other weekend with our son if there were no issues. The arrangement was put in place, and over time the visits extended to 3 or 4 hours. We began to have some positive interactions, and I noticed improvements in Kay. I was pleased to see our son enjoying his time with his mother, even though I remained emotionally distant. During the fifth visit, an incident occurred that tested my resolve. Kay came up behind me and hugged my arm while I was watching our son play. The unexpected physical contact triggered a strong reaction from me. I shouted at her to never touch me again, and she quickly hugged our son before leaving. The following week, we resumed our visits without addressing the incident, and Kay maintained a respectful distance. As the weeks progressed, we began discussing everyday matters more openly. I had secured a new job with a higher salary, and Kay had started nursing school. During one of our conversations, she mentioned that the janitor had been persistently contacting her and had even shown up at her parents' house. Her father had threatened him to stay away, which was a relief. I reassured Kay that I didn't care who she was with, and she insisted she wasn't seeing anyone and wouldn't until we were certain that reconciliation was impossible. I made it clear that reconciliation was not an option for me. 6 months after our separation, I broached the subject of finalizing the divorce. Kay agreed to come over to discuss it, and if necessary, sign the papers. When she arrived, she brought several notebooks with her. She explained that she had been writing about everything that had happened since she received the divorce papers. She had detailed her experiences and emotions, warning me that it would be painful to read. Reading her notebooks was a harrowing experience. Her descriptions of the affair were painful to digest, but it was the passages about her mental breakdown and her distorted beliefs that hit me hardest. One particularly troubling entry revealed her irrational belief that if she had not reached orgasm during her encounters with the janitor, it meant she hadn't truly enjoyed the affair, thereby absolving her of responsibility. This delusion was eventually dispelled by her father, who had confronted her about it. While reading the notebooks did not change my decision about the divorce, it provided me with a deeper understanding of Kay's fragile mental state. Her writings, which began as disorganized and chaotic, gradually became more coherent as she worked through her thoughts and feelings. It was clear she was struggling with significant emotional turmoil. Despite my decision to move forward with the divorce, I agreed to give Kay some more time. I wanted to ensure that our son had a stable environment and that Kay was genuinely working towards her own recovery. The process of reading her journals and reflecting on her mental state made me more empathetic, though my resolve to end our marriage remained firm. Kay's insistence that I write to her was a turning point in our reconciliation process. She believed that if I put my thoughts and feelings into writing, it might offer her a clearer perspective on how to support me and aid my recovery. At first, I was hesitant. I was still deeply wounded and struggling to move forward. However, I recognized that this could be a way to help me process the trauma and possibly salvage some form of a healthy relationship in the future. Her writing therapy, as I came to call it, began to take shape. We agreed to meet twice a week for these sessions. Our first assignment was to write down our perceptions of the state of our marriage before D-Day. We exchanged letters during our meetings and made notes on each other's writings. Each session involved a detailed exchange of questions and answers, with a rule that we had to answer honestly. There was to be no yelling and no refusing to answer any questions. We would tackle each query until we had thoroughly discussed it and then move on to the next one. If we didn't finish, we carried over unresolved questions to the next meeting. We began with an analysis of our marriage prior to the affair and worked through each day leading up to and including the day I spoke with her father after she received the divorce papers. After that, we would reevaluate and decide how to proceed. I must admit, my approach during these meetings was far from compassionate. While I answered questions truthfully, I used the opportunity to humiliate Kay. I made her recount, in painful detail, the hurtful things she had said about me to the janitor. I forced her to describe the sexual encounters in excruciating detail. Though the encounters themselves were relatively mild compared to what we had shared, hearing about them was still deeply painful. My cruelty, though driven by my own hurt and anger, was inexcusable. I was determined to make her relive the pain she had caused me. Despite my harshness, the process did have a beneficial effect over time. After about a month, Kay suggested that we take the next step and have her move back in. I was firm in my decision to refuse. She pleaded with me and presented a strong argument for why it might be beneficial, but I stood my ground. I told her that even if I were open to reconciliation, The idea of being intimate with her again was inconceivable. Kay offered that I could see other people while she remained faithful, but I was adamant that this was not something I wanted. After another month of struggling with my feelings and Kay's persistence, I relented and agreed to let her move back in, though I imposed strict rules. First, she was to sleep in the spare room. Second, there was to be no physical contact of any kind. Third, she would handle her own finances, but I would manage her banking and provide her with checks for bills, including rent for the room and personal expenses. This arrangement stemmed from the fact that she had previously taken $300 from our savings to give to the janitor. I wanted to retain control over her finances to prevent any further misuse. Fourth, her mother was not allowed in my home until we reached a clearer decision about reconciliation. My resentment toward her mother still lingered. Fifth, if we did not reconcile, the previous custody arrangements would automatically take effect. Lastly, if I started seeing someone else, Kay had 1 week to move out. Kay agreed to these terms and moved in. Living together again was more challenging than I had anticipated. With Kay present in the house all the time, there was no longer a cooling-off period between our interactions. Small disagreements escalated into frequent arguments. I often said hurtful things, driven by lingering resentment and a desire to push her away. To manage this, we established Thursday night fight night. This concept emerged from our written meetings. Every Thursday night, after our son was asleep, we would sit down to discuss any ongoing issues or unresolved arguments. We made it a rule that everything had to be settled by the end of the night. This practice evolved into a more casual check-in over dinner, where we simply asked if there were any topics we needed to address. Our children never knew about the origins or specifics of these sessions. Throughout this period, I continued to use Kay's affair against her whenever I could. I threw her betrayal in her face, but she handled it with surprising strength and restraint. She refused to engage in confrontations and remained focused on rebuilding our relationship, even though I was being emotionally abusive. Kay was committed to proving that we were meant to be together and believed that despite the damage she had done, she could help restore our marriage if I could see what she saw and join her in the effort. About 6 months after Kay moved back in, I had a significant breakthrough. After a particularly grueling day filled with triggers and emotional turmoil, I locked myself in the bedroom, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. Kay came to the door and knocked softly, telling me I needed to talk and that she would be outside the door when I was ready. She sat on the floor with her back against the door and stayed there for an hour, nearly until midnight. When I finally opened the door, she asked if she could come in, but I directed her to her own room. We sat there with her on the bed and me in a chair, and I finally began to open up about what had happened after I kicked her out the night I discovered the affair. This moment marked a turning point in our journey. It was a raw and vulnerable exchange, where I shared the depth of my pain and the turmoil I had been through since that night. Kay listened intently, and for the first time, we began to address the full scope of the emotional damage caused by the affair. This was a critical step in our process of healing, though it was just one part of a much longer and more complex journey. Flashback to the evening of D-Day. After Kay drove away that night, I found myself trapped in a dark, solitary haze. I spent hours in our son's room, simply watching him sleep. His innocent, peaceful face contrasted sharply with the storm raging in my mind. I needed something to occupy my thoughts, so I retrieved the checkbook, bill ledger, and a copy of the life insurance policy. I placed these items on the kitchen table where they would be in plain view. I then took a long, hot shower, trying to wash away the turmoil that had settled into my bones. In a detached, methodical manner, I went into the bedroom, took the shotgun down from the closet shelf, and laid it on the bed. I dressed carefully in a pair of jeans and a button-down shirt, tucking in my shirt and combing my hair. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the shotgun. I stuck the barrel in my mouth, tasting the oil on its surface. The taste was metallic and bitter, just as I had imagined. I have no idea how long I sat there, grappling with the weight of my decision. Eventually, I rose, unloaded the gun, and put it back in the closet. I stripped off my clothes and crawled into bed, feeling the crushing weight of despair. It's a dark path that many betrayed spouses tread, driven by the overwhelming sense of betrayal and loss. When I shared this with Kay later on, it was the only aspect of my inner turmoil I had kept from her during our recovery. For the first time, I allowed her to hug me and kiss me on the forehead, without it being a mere goodbye or a parting gesture. It was a moment of genuine emotional connection. I told her I had forgiven her that night, though at that moment I hadn't truly meant it. It took several more months before I could genuinely forgive her, but admitting it then was a small step towards healing. Slowly, physical touch began to re-enter our relationship. We started with simple gestures, holding hands, sharing a kiss goodbye, and exchanging hugs. These small acts of affection became more frequent and eventually led to us being intimate again, almost a year after she had moved back in. It was what's often referred to as hysterical bonding, a phenomenon where couples driven by a need to reconnect engage in frequent and intense physical intimacy. According to Kay, we had sex 32 times in 28 days during this period. Years later, she confided that until that night, she woke up each day believing it could be our last. She told herself to hold on for just one more day, knowing that physical intimacy was a sign of rebonding for me. Today, our marriage is strong and fulfilling. Both of us have achieved success in our careers, and we have 3 grown children. As far as we know, they are unaware of the past turmoil we endured. We have no plans to disclose it to them, but we are also prepared to be honest if they ever ask. Our experiences have profoundly changed us both. Kay has become stronger and wiser, viewing this period as a painful but necessary lesson. She sometimes seems to punish herself for her past mistakes, though she has made tremendous strides in overcoming them. For my part, I have become more reserved. I keep many of my feelings to myself and tackle them privately. While I strive to support Kay emotionally, I no longer act as her emotional crutch. I require her to communicate her issues and devise plans to address them, which I will help implement. I love her deeply, though the love has evolved. It is different now, more realistic, but intensely real nonetheless. I believe that in losing a part of the good in me, Kay has become a better person, and I've come to terms with that. If my story can offer any help to others facing similar struggles, I hope it does. Every situation is unique, and what worked for us may not work for everyone. The key is to focus on yourself first. Manage what you can control and take care of your own well-being. Be a bit selfish if needed, and only then consider the possibility of rebuilding a relationship. Embrace the wisdom of the serenity prayer. Accept what you cannot change, have the courage to change what you can, and seek the wisdom to know the difference. Our story is a testament to the fact that, despite the darkest moments, there can be a brighter future on the other side of pain if you're willing to put in the effort for yourself. I wish everyone navigating this challenging journey all the best. Healing and growth are possible, and you can emerge stronger and more fulfilled on the other side.